Hi guys, this is Andrew Burgess for Nettuts, and today we are doing the second chapter of our Ruby screencast series, Ruby for Newbies. In this series, in this chapter, we're going to look at a number of different types, object types in Ruby. We're going to look at assigning them to variables, and maybe we'll even get to look at a bit of objects in Ruby. So let's get started right now. All right, I'm going to open up my terminal here because we're going to be doing most of this in IRB, which we met last week. Now, before I get started, before I run my IRB command, I have to tell the Ruby version manager what version of Ruby I want to use because I am using RVM to control my installation of Ruby on this computer. I didn't mention RVM in Chapter 1's screencast. I think I did mention it in the text. But since then, I've had a chance to try it out, and I really think that if you're on a Mac, RVM is probably the best way to use Ruby. So you'll want to look into that. All right, so now that I'm using Ruby 1.9.2, and I should probably just add that line to my bash rc file, I'll open up my interactive Ruby shell. So, variables. In some languages, you have to put a keyword before the name of your variable. For example, in JavaScript, we have var, and then we put our variable name, and then we have the value after that. In others, like PHP, we just use a $sign or something like that. Some even you have to put the type of variable, like in Java. Whoops, that's what you have to do. However, in Ruby, none of that is required. For just a normal local variable, and for global variables and class or instant variables, once we get into some more object-oriented stuff, it'll be a bit different. But right now, for just local variables, you just have to put the variable name and then the variable value after the equal sign, just like that. So, variable name equals variable value, pretty run-of-the-mill for most programming. And you can see here, as a reminder, what IRB does, it outputs the value after this arrow sign here. It outputs the value that we get from the evaluation of this line of code here. Now, it just so happens that the variable type that we've used here is a string. So let's look at strings a bit more. As you can see here, we use double quotes around this string. We could also use single quotes. So, So let's show how you can use single quotes. Just like that, if I was going to do that, you can see we have a single quoted string. Of course, you want to remember when using single quotes or double quotes that you have to escape whatever quote you're using within the quote. So if we do something like that, you can see I have to escape the double quote there in that very informal contraction. Otherwise, and you can see how here it just converts it to double quotes for our representation there, because really it doesn't matter when it's stored in memory. Double quote, single quote doesn't make a difference. However, there is a difference in the evaluation of the string. In double quotes, it's similar to what you would do in PHP. In PHP, let's create a name variable here. We'll say name is Andrew. So that's just a normal string. If in PHP, if we were going to, let's use our put s function, which we learned about last time. If we were going to say, hi, my name is, in something like JavaScript, we would do plus name. And that works here in Ruby. In PHP, variables start with a $sign, and so we could do something like this, hi, my name is, and then put the $sign, put the name of the variable in there. And since PHP knows it's a variable, it will replace that with the name, with the value of that variable, and this is called string interpolation, I believe. Of course, in PHP, this only works in double quotes. In Ruby, the way you do string interpolation is you put a hash, an opening curly brace, and then the name of the variable. And as you can see there, now we have hi, my name is Andrew, output to our console here. However, string interpolation in Ruby, as we've seen here, with these delimiters that we have, our hash, opening curly brace, and enclosed curly brace, works for more than just variable names. So I'm not sure if you can do this in PHP, but we can do something like this. 1 plus 2 equals, and then in here we put 1 plus 2, like that, and you can see our output here is 1 plus 2 equals 3. So you can basically put any Ruby code inside the string interpolation delimiters, and the Ruby compiler will evaluate that code and plug the result into that string. Okay, so that's the basics of string. What about numbers? Numbers in Ruby are pretty simple. Basically, we have integers and floating point numbers, similar to other languages. And those are two different number types in Ruby. And actually, integer has two subtypes, which we don't need to get into right now. But for now, you can have mynum, for example, just a regular number. You could have a float, which is something like that. And of course, these can be added easily. We have mynum plus myFloat. And as you can see, we get the result 3.3, so it keeps that as a float. We don't lose that as we might in something like Java or have any kind of type coercion errors. Okay. Now, Ruby has a really neat bit of syntactic sugar, and you'll find as we get into more of this that Ruby has a lot of neat syntactic sugar. But right now, let's just look at this bit that goes with numbers. When writing numbers in normal everyday life, we separate every 3 digits with commas, at least writing in English, with commas, just to make it easier to see how big that number is. If I leave those out, you just got a long string of zeros there, and it kind of makes it hard to see at a glance how big this number really is. Well, when programming, you can't really do that because commas have a actual meaning apart from separating digits. So if we, let me just give this a variable here. We'll call it billion. So normally, in most programming languages, you just have to leave those out, and you just kind of have to stare at the screen and get your finger up there and count out how many digits you've got. However, in Ruby, and I just lost that. However, in Ruby, it's pretty easy because you can use underscores in the place of your commas there, and the Ruby interpreter understands exactly what that means, and it makes it easy for you to see in your code, oh yeah, that's a billion, and you don't have to get up there and count them out. And so that's one little bit of syntactic sugar that Ruby gives you, just making it easier for you as the coder. Let's move on to arrays in Ruby. To create an array, you can do two things. First, and you probably won't use this very often, you just call the array class, because Ruby is a very, very class-based language. In fact, everything in Ruby is an instance of a class. I think. Pretty much everything. So you could call array.new, and we'll talk about that syntax more a bit later. And you can see here that we've just got 2 square brackets there. Or you can use the array literal, which is those 2 square brackets, just like that, to create your array literal notation. When you're putting items in your array, of course, you can do all the standard stuff. So you can do array.push Andrew like that, and you see now we have an array with one thing in it. You can do, so we have array push, and we'll talk more about methods on strings and numbers and arrays a bit later, or in a future chapter. If you're going to use notation, you can use square brackets just as you would in JavaScript, and we can put another name here, John, just like that. And you can see now if I type out my array, we have Andrew, John. Of course, we can continue. Let's try doing 3, skipping 2. See what happens there. Joe. And now just output my array. And you can see it has nil, which is Ruby's false value, or Ruby's nothing value, if you will, in JavaScript. It's null. And so that's what nil is, what you get in Ruby. So you can see how that works. And of course, reading them back is just as easy. You can go like that. You can see we got nil there, John, etc. Just like that. So arrays are pretty simple to use in JavaScript. Of course, you can instantiate your arrays when you do this. So if we just say my other array here, if you want to build it with those objects right in, you can just put Joe, John, continue. and I forgot to put a comma there between John and ad infinitum. Not even sure if I spelled that right. And that's why I put those two together like that. So I shouldn't have, but anyway, missing comma. That's what happened. All right. Now let's look at hashes. Hashes are very similar to object literals in JavaScript, and you've got hashes in many other languages as well. Or hashes, I guess you could say they're similar to, I'm trying to remember what that term is. In PHP, the arrays, where the arrays have both a key and a value. Associative array, that's what they're called, I believe. Okay, so hashes is what they're called in Ruby, and we can create them, as you might suspect, either by calling hash.new, and as you can see, we get an empty pair of curly braces there, or using the hash literal notation and using those or the curly brackets just like that. So how can we put items into our hash? Well, in JavaScript, we would use the dot notation most often. So we would say hash dot name equals Andrew, something like that. However, in JavaScript, in Ruby, that doesn't work. We would have to do name, but we have to use a square bracket notation. However, because that's in there, we can't just give it a blank value because we're using the square. However, because we're using the square bracket notation, we have to put quotes around the value that's in there. And so if we go like that, and now we type out, we print my hash. If I can type it, print my hash to the console, you can see we have name equals Andrew. And as you can see there, we've used that arrow to denote the key and the value. And if we were to type out the hash when we instantiate it, that's exactly how we would do it. We would say name equal sign greater than sign to make a little arrow, name pointing to Andrew. There we would go. And I should note we've used the string name as the identifier or as the key for our value, Andrew. And in Ruby, that's not necessary. We can use any type, any object type we want as the key. So let's put something into my hash that we already had here. We could put we could put an item called 2, and we could say, or actually let's put something a little higher, 10, so we can see how this works. 10 equals, and I hit enter, but that's okay because it realizes I'm not done and it waits for me to finish that there. And now if we put out my hash, you can see it's not like what happened with an array where we got a whole bunch of nil values to make up for the spot that we want in the array. 10 is actually just the key for our value 10, and so we can have whatever. We don't have to fill all those in. So you can use whatever type you want there for a hash. In fact, although I do not see any reason why you would do this, you could put an array in as your hash and do something like this. And now if we print out my hash, you can see here that this array is the key for this string. And of course, you could have I've just used strings here as the values, but you'll have many other values. One value, or one object type commonly used as your keys in a hash in many Ruby programs, and you'll find this to be one of the many Ruby conventions that we'll learn over time, is to use symbols as the keys in your hashes. So what is a symbol? A symbol is a lightweight string in Ruby. Think of times when you've had to have some kind of identifier in your programming that it needs to be a unique value. There's going to be multiple values, multiple options for this value, but it doesn't need to be printed out anywhere. The user never needs to see it. So it's just something to, for example, let's say in Tumblr, you've got different types of posts, something like that, where you've got a bunch of different types of post types you could use, but the user never really needs to see that. And although I know in Tumblr that ends up being a class name or something like that, I believe. That was a bad example, but something like that. Symbols are what you use, and I believe they're like, they call them lightweight strings in Ruby. And the way you do a symbol is just a colon and then your symbol name. Right, like that. And you can see there we've created a symbol called symbol name. And often these are used for options in Ruby as the hash names. If you're passing a hash of options to a method, usually they'll use symbols as the keys for those hashes. So let's show a little example here. We can have person equal, and so we can do the symbol name equals, and we can say Joe, symbol age equals 35, and that should be a number. And then we can say occupation, arrow, and notice I forgot the arrow there. Arrow, let's say plumber, and there we've created a person hash, and now when referring to them, we just use that symbol just like that. So you can see we have person.name, or not dot, but square bracket, name, person, age, and person occupation. There you go. So those are symbols. Of course, Ruby also has the standard values of true and false, which are objects in themselves, and those are the Boolean values, and there's really not much more to say about them. Of course, we already talked about nil, which is Ruby's nothing value, and nil values are always hard to describe because in Ruby, nil describes nothing, although nil is an object. It is the only object, as are true and false, of their class. You can't create another object of the true class, and it's not called the true class. It's called, oh yeah, it is called true class. Okay, this is a little tip here. There are many methods that are built into all the Ruby objects, and you can type .class to see what class they're of. So we can say false.class and see it's called false class, and nil.class is of the nil class. And true class, false class, and nil class only have one instantiation in each of those cases, which are the values true, false, and nil, which you'll see often in your Ruby programs. Let's now talk about methods on objects. We've seen how in Ruby everything is an object. Even the true, false, and nil values are instances of a class, which makes them an object. Here we've got a string, name equals Andrew, and because name is an object and it has methods, we can call them. So we can say name upcase. As you can see, it puts everything uppercase. We can say name downcase, and that lowercase is everything in the string. Notice we don't have to call those methods with parentheses at the end. We can create methods for objects that already exist, and we can create methods for classes that already exist as well. And we're going to look at how to do that now. Next week, we will look at creating objects and classes of our own. But for this week, let's just look at modifying existing stuff. Okay, so we have this name variable. Let's say we want to have a method on it that means that we'll add our last name to it. There are two ways we could do it. We could apply it to every string, or we could apply it just to this string. First, let's apply it just to this string. That's called a singleton method. We do this, of course, as we define any method or function by using the def keyword. Next, we say name, because name is the object we want to apply it to, dot the name of the function. So we'll call it add last name. Now, we can return the string, because remember, Ruby returns the last line of every function as the return value of that function. So we refer to the string itself using the self keyword. In other languages, such as JavaScript or PHP, you would use this, and then we can just say Burgess. And now, if we run name.add last name, you can see we have Andrew Burgess. There we go. Of course, this doesn't affect name because we're returning a new string. Okay, so how would we apply this to any string? Let's create another string here called name2. We'll say this equals Joe. Now, if we call name2 dot add last name, we get a no method error, undefined method add last name for Joe string. Let's create an add last name method for every class. Of course, ideally we would create a new object called person, and we would have first name and last name properties on that object. However, in this little example, we're going to add it directly to the string. The way we do this is by opening the string. So we say class string. Now we're inside the class string. So we're going to define a new instance method. We're going to call it add last name, And because we already have that on name, we're just going to say 2 just to make sure we really know it's a different one. All right, now we have self, remember, which refers to the string. And then we're just going to say last name goes here, because really this is not the ideal way to do this. However, it works for our example. And of course, you might want to modify string in other cases. So now, if we say name2 dot add last name 2, you can see here we get Joe, last name goes here. If we do this on number 1, you can see Andrew, last name goes here. Notice how both these strings were created before we added this method to the string class, but they both still get it. There's one other way that we could do this, but we're not going to talk about that now, and that would be by creating a subclass of string, and we could call it string with last name or something like that. And that way, and then create an instance of string with last name class. So those are really the 3 different ways of adding methods to objects. All right, I said we would talk about one more thing in this lesson, and that is putting your Ruby in files. If I come down here and open up MacVim, we can create a Ruby file very easily. Let's write just a bit of code in here. So let's have a variable. We'll say name equals Joe the plumber. Now I'm going to save this file. Let me first use Vim to move to the desktop here so we have the file. And now I'll save the file as joe.rb. Now we get some syntax highlighting here because because Vim recognizes the Ruby language. Okay, now let's write a function here, and we're going to call it just say hi, something simple. And we're going to say we'll use a few things we've learned here by escaping. Escape a string here, say hi there, and now we have to escape another quote. Said name. Notice how our syntax highlighter recognized that name was a variable and not part of the string, and we escaped those 2 double quotes. So even though our whole string is written in double quotes, we can still have double quotes within it. So that covers a couple of things we've learned here. And actually, you know what? To make it make it cover even more, let's do this. Let's say name dot say hi, and then we have to change name here to self. All right, I'll save that. So now we've created a variable, created a singleton method on that variable, and we've used string interpolation and escaping special characters within strings, which is basically everything we learned today. And now we're just going to say name dot say hi. It's that simple. All right, so now we'll come back here to Ruby. I'm going to exit out of IRB, and let me clear the console here. Let me change to the desktop. If we list the files, you can see we have joe.rb there. Now, one way to do this would be to type Ruby, joe.rb, and hit enter. And you can see we don't get any output in this case. Why don't we get any output? Well, this is something important to realize. The difference between storing Ruby in a file and writing it directly into IRB. In this case, if we type this into IRB, all this stuff right here, we would get, hi there, said Joe the plumber, printed right out to the console. And so you would expect that's what you get printed out right here when we run the joe.rb file. However, we never tell anything to print out to the console in this code we've written here. IRB just does that because that's what the interactive Ruby shell does. If we really want this all to print out to the console, we have to do this. We would have to use the put s function to put this string out to the console. Let's do one more thing here and change this to, we'll say response equals that, and then we can put the response to the console and then return response. This has absolutely no value in our current case, but the reason I'm doing this is to show you how, so we have this response here, we'll put it out to the console, and then let's say we were going to do something with this. So if we were going to, let's say, we'll just say response out here, Of course, because of scope inside the function and outside this function, those don't conflict. And then we can put response out here. So you can see what this does is we're putting it out to the console within the function, and then this last line returns it. And then this would store the return in a variable and put the variable out here. Really, you would never do something like this. But so let's actually, what we can do is remove all that, just like that, to make it something a bit more realistic. But you can see how that would have worked. Now, if we come back here, we've saved the file, and now I run that. We have an undefined local variable or method response. Oh, typo here. Okay. Response, and I still don't think I've spelled that right. There we go. Now I've saved it. We can come back here, and we get, "Hi there, said Joe the plumber," run, printed out to the command line. Well, that's all we have today for Ruby for Newbies Chapter 2. In review, we've looked at variables, strings, numbers, arrays, hashes, symbols, booleans, and the nil value, to be exact. We've looked at the object basics. We've looked at instance methods. We've also looked at singleton methods. And we talked very briefly about inheriting a class, although we didn't show that. And finally, we've shown how to put Ruby in a file of its own and how it's a bit different from running IRB. Remember, the file extension is .rb. Well, that's all I've got for today. Oh, no, wait, actually, I've got one more thing for you. In each of these lessons, I'm going to point out a usually free Ruby resource for you to check out. Today, we're going to look at, or I'm just going to mention for you to look at, tryruby.org. This is a really neat little web app that has something very similar to the interactive Ruby console or shell right on your web page. And as you type out different commands, it's going to give you instructions and lead you through an introduction to Ruby. In 15 minutes, you can get reasonably comfortable with Ruby, and I really recommend you go and try this out. I did when I was starting with Ruby, and it's really, really neat. It's incredible what they can do in a web browser. I'm not exactly sure what they're doing on the back end, whether it's really getting the Ruby compiler to compile the code. I haven't looked behind it too much, but you want to check it out because it's really, really neat. And that is really all I've got for you today. So thanks for watching Ruby for Newbies Chapter 2, and let me know what you think in the comments. Bye!